Secretary to the Government of the Federation and Chairman, Presidential Task Force on COVID-19, Honorable Ministers, members of the PTF COVID-19, Nigerians watching us from the various offices and homes, gentlemen of the press, a very good afternoon to you. Today is Monday, 18th May 2020, and I welcome you to the national briefing by the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19. We're going to start in earnest. We'll take the brief from the chairman on the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19. Thereafter, we shall take the updates from the Minister of Health, the Director General, NCDC, the National Coordinator in one group. Then we'll take the Honorable Minister of Aviation and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So we'll begin this afternoon with the Chairman of the Presidential Task Force, SGF, sir.
Members of the Presidential Task Force, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, gentlemen of the press, I welcome you to the national briefing by the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19 for Monday, 18th May 2020. Today's briefing is significant as it provides us an opportunity to assess progress made in the first phase of our three-pronged strategy and communicate Mr. President's directive on the next step of our national response to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the commencement of our national response, we informed Nigerians that the COVID-19 pandemic is the greatest public health challenge of our generation. The Presidential Task Force also developed a multi-sectoral national response, bearing in mind the fact that we were traversing uncharted territories and that there was no cure for the virus in sight. As at date, the President has addressed the nation 3 times to underscore the seriousness of the situation. On each of those occasions, he pronounced measures aimed at containing and controlling the spread of the disease. Some of these measures, introduced in phases and modified as we progress, include lockdown of specific high-burden areas, travel ban, nationwide curfew, as well as adversaries aimed at escalating our infection, prevention, and control strategies. In the national broadcast of 27 April 2020, Mr. President announced a phased and gradual easing of the lockdown in Lagos and Ogun State, as well as the Federal Capital Territory, along with additional nationwide measures aimed at ensuring that our economy continued to function within limiting constraints posed by COVID-19 pandemic, while maintaining a delicate balance between safety and economy. In a precarious situation, Mr. President focused on achieving the following. 1, ensuring that socio-economic difficulties experienced during the total lockdown were alleviated without compromising safety. 2, allowing the healthcare sector to continue preparing the identified metrics needed to manage the response and any potential future outbreak nationwide. And 3, increasing the sensitization of the populace and empowering communities to start driving the response through taking personal responsibility by adhering to stated guidelines. Achieving the foregoing objectives was predicated on adherence to the guidelines issued by the PTF COVID-19, adaptation and cooperation by the states, ownership by the communities, as well as businesses, professional bodies, labor leaders, faith-based organizations, traditional rulers, and particularly individuals taking responsibility. The Presidential Task Force continued to assess the level of compliance with the guidelines which came into effect on 4th May 2020. While emphasizing ownership, we consistently shared some aspects of the assessment during our daily national briefings, pointing in the direction of non-compliance. Nevertheless, we are pleased to inform you that measures put in place yielded sufficient progress that requires consolidation to ensure that the health system and economy are in a position to adequately respond to any potential outcomes in the future, including a secondary outbreak. The gradual reopening of the economy has been signposted by the controlled opening and increased access to markets and supermarkets, banks, and other income-yielding activities for the vulnerable population. Similarly, corporations and government offices partially opened their operations and services so as to facilitate the activities of other sectors. Some manufacturing, construction, and allied sectors also resumed. All these sectors ensured that adequate infection mitigation measures were put in place. In recognition of the global impact of COVID-19 on economies and the need to stimulate and positively turn around our economy, the federal government has been implementing various stimulus packages offered to businesses and state governments through the Central Bank of Nigeria. These stimulus include: 1, the reduction of interest rates from 9% to 5% for all CBN interventions facilities. 2, restructuring of loans to longer tenures for all companies whose businesses are adversely impacted by COVID-19. 3, a 50 billion naira facility to households and businesses adversely impacted by COVID-19 through the National Microfinance Bank. 4, 100 billion facility to pharmaceutical and health sector companies to retool their businesses. And 5, a 1 trillion naira facility to agriculture and manufacturing companies to expand and set up new factories. And 6, suspension of repayment of all state government loans for 1 year to give states ample financing room to pay salaries. Within the last 2 weeks of phase one of the ease lockdown, the following accomplishments were also recorded. 1, increase in the number of laboratories in the COVID-19 network from 15 to 26 as of this morning. 2, additional 15,558 tests were conducted in the country with a cumulative total of 35,098 tests, and the number of tests per million increasing from 50 to 154. 3, increase in the number of trained personnel to 11,409 health workers, thereby boosting capacity for case management. 4, procurement and distribution of additional personal protective equipment and ventilators across the country. 5, doubling time of the virus has slowed down from 7 days to 11 days. And 6, The number of beds available for isolation and case management has increased from 3,500 to 5,000 beds nationwide. 7, the efficiency of the identification, testing, evacuation, and isolation process for confirmed cases has increased. And lastly, H, progressive improvement in capacity of the health system to respond to the outbreak. In mobilizing all sectors and communities to take individual and collective responsibility in the fight against the pandemic in our national response, the Presidential Task Force remains highly appreciative of the efforts of the private sector, the public-spirited Nigerians, corporate organizations, the armed forces, the intelligence and security community, the media, as well as the international community for their unquantifiable support in the battle against the COVID-19. The response has been overwhelming and encouraging. Last week, the Office of the Accountant General of the Federation introduced the transparency dimensions in the management of certain components of financial donations by publishing the receipts in the newspapers. I, in addition, explained the processes for other components so that Nigerians can be assured that accountability remains the hallmark of this administration and the Presidential Task Force. All monies donated are safe and secure and will be judiciously utilized and accounted for. Ladies and gentlemen, the outcomes of the first phase of the ease lockdown have been mixed. While some objectives were met, our assessment showed that non-compliance was rampant, but the Presidential Task Force nevertheless continued to persuade the populace through its messaging and daily briefing on the need to take responsibility. As I mentioned, on Thursday, 14th May 2020, the Presidential Task Force briefed the Federal Executive Council and the National Council of State and the National Security Council on the progress made and the challenges. It has similarly submitted its report to Mr. President at the conclusion of this phase on Sunday, 17th May 2020. The Presidential Task Force considered it important to let you know that it has relied largely on science, statistics, lessons learned from other parts of the world, and an evaluation of our peculiar circumstances to draw its conclusions on the outcome of the last 2 weeks. For example, our surveillance, infection prevention and control activities identified 9 high-burden local government areas in the Federation, reporting higher number of cases, accounting for 51% of the total number of infections in the country. All the 9 are densely populated local government areas nationwide. We have also seen that though Nigeria's caseload still lags behind several other countries, our large population and relatively high degree of mobility and urbanization, almost 50%, places us at an increased high risk of high transmissibility. Therefore, our consideration of ease of restriction has to balance lives and livelihoods, and the slow and gradual phased approach should be science and data-driven. To arrive at our final recommendations to Mr. President, we objectively and frankly interrogated certain critical factors and wish to inform you as follows. Number 1, is the transmission of the virus under control? Yes, we would say to some extent, measures put in place have collectively slowed down the transmission of the virus, e.g., elongating the doubling time, which has ranged from 7 to 11 days. 2, Is the healthcare system equipped to detect, test, isolate, and treat every case and trace every person who came in contact with a positive case? Healthcare system has been better equipped to detect, test, isolate, and treat every case and trace every person who came into contact with a positive case, with the increase in the number of laboratories from 15 to 26, ramping up of testing to a cumulative total of 35,098. 3, are outbreaks minimized in special settings like health facilities and nursing homes? Though we have recorded infection of a number of medical personnel in our facilities, which is not peculiar to Nigeria, we have increased their training in care management and provided additional personal protective equipment for our workers. 4, are there measures in workplaces or schools to prevent the spread of the virus? With the gradual reopening of workplaces, markets, later schools, prescriptions have been made for the prevention of infection and the spread of the virus. And 5, are the risk of importing more cases from outside the country being managed? The risk associated with importation has been seriously minimized with the ban on flights, closure of borders, and the mandatory 14-day quarantine for anyone arriving in Nigeria. And lastly, 6, are local communities educated, engaged, and empowered to adjust to the new norm? To a large extent, engagement with communities and other stakeholders has become the new focus of our strategy, and we will continue to drive that as much as possible so that communities can take ownership of the management and prevention of the spread of this virus. The inevitable conclusion of the PTF is that the fight against COVID-19 is long-term, as the virus is not likely to go away very soon. This is further underscored by the fact that no vaccine is expected till around the end of 2021. Nigeria is not where we wish to be in terms of control, ownership, infrastructure, and change of behavior. We must do more. Last week, we hinted about the refocusing of our policy on community ownership going forward. We shall intensify the mobilization of individuals, especially the communities, to take ownership of this fight. This will be accompanied by a corresponding development of infrastructure and other public health measures to be undertaken in every community and at every phase of the response. This includes surveillance, case finding, testing, isolation, tracing, and quarantining contacts. Ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that in spite of the modest progress made, Nigeria is not yet ready for full opening of the economy, and tough decisions have to be taken for the good of the greater majority. Any relaxation would only portend grave danger for our populace. Advisedly, the current phase of eased restriction will be maintained for another 2 weeks, during which stricter enforcement and persuasion measures will be pursued. The 2 weeks extension of phase 1 of the eased restriction is also to enable other segments of the economy prepare adequately for compliance with the guidelines, preparatory to reopening in the coming weeks. For the Presidential Task Force, we share your pains, but our future is in the hands of every Nigerian, and future decisions would depend greatly on our compliance. Based on the recommendations of the Presidential Task Force, Mr. President has approved the following. 1. The measures, exemptions, advisories, and scopes of entities allowed to reopen under Phase 1 of the eased lockdown shall be maintained across the Federation for another 2 weeks, effective from today, 18th May, until the 1st of June 2020. 2. Intensifying efforts to tell, communicate, trace, identify, and test manage cases. 3. Elevating the level of community ownership of non-pharmaceutical interventions. And 4. Maintain the existing lockdown in Kano for another 2 weeks. 5. Imposition of precision lockdown in states or in metropolitan and high-burden local governments that are reporting a rapidly increasing number of cases when the need arises. This will be complemented with the provision of palliatives and continued re-evaluation of the impact of the interventions. And 6, aggressive scale-up of efforts to ensure that communities are informed, engaged, and participating in the response with enhanced public awareness in high-risk areas. Specific implementation guidelines will be communicated by the National Coordinator during this press briefing and will be circulated through the conventional and social media. For sustainability of the gains recorded, the Presidential Task Force shall continue to support states by developing guidelines to shape decision-making for future steps in the response and aggressively scale up efforts to ensure effective community information. It is believed that these steps would help consolidate the gains made so far and position the country to effectively overcome the pandemic. In the interest of our nation, the role of the states and the local governments remain critical to the success. The PTF shall engage with the states on the effective implementation of these guidelines. This morning, I participated in a virtual conference between the President and the Nigerian Governors Forum, and the subject of collaboration was robustly discussed. As contained in the address of Mr. President on the 27th of April 2020, state governors are reminded to align their specific state measures with the guidelines issued by the Presidential Task Force. The level of compliance has been reviewed, and a specific directive has been issued to the security agencies to carry out strict enforcement of all measures. This includes the nationwide curfew between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m., the ban on interstate travels, and the wearing of face masks and coverings in public places. The security agents are, however, urged to be mindful of the human rights of citizens, while citizens are equally urged to encourage and recognize the dangers posed to self, their loved ones, and the entire community if they fail to take responsibility. Let me state categorically that the exemptions allowed under the Phase 1 are still in place. Particularly, government remains conscious of the fact that we are in the rainy season and farming activities is critical to food and national security. It should therefore not be hindered in any way. I therefore urge states and security agencies to support, encourage, and allow our farmers to carry out their activities unhindered. We wish to appeal to all Nigerians to show understanding, demonstrate patriotism, and take full responsibility. Humanity is in great peril, and we are all in danger. Most importantly, we repeat our call to all Nigerians to please stay home if necessary and stay safe. I now call on the Honorable Minister of Health, State, and the DG, Nigerian Center for Disease Control, to update the nation on current developments, while the National Coordinator would present the new guidelines and further clarifications. I wish to thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Chairman of the Presidential Task Force, and I also want to acknowledge the presence of my colleagues in the team. Respected media representatives here present, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Since the last briefing on Friday, 15th May 2020, we have recorded a total of 797 new cases, with 288 on Friday and 176 on Saturday, 16th May 2020. In the last day, we recorded a total of 338 new COVID-19 cases in 17 states. This is the highest daily record yet, with the following breakdown: Lagos 177, Kano 64, FCT 21, Rivers 16, Plateau 14, Oyo 11, Katsina 9, Jigawa 4, Kaduna 4, Abia 3, Bauchi 3, Borno 3, Gombe 2, Akwa Ibom 2, Delta 2, and 1 each in Ondo, Kebbi, and Sokoto, bringing the total number of confirmed cases in Nigeria to 5,959 in 34 states and the Federal Capital Territory. Till date, 1,594 patients have been treated and discharged from hospital care. Sadly, we have recorded 182 deaths in 26 states and the Federal Capital Territory, with Lagos, Kano, and Borno accounting for 52% of the deaths. About 60% of all the confirmed cases are between the ages of 21 and 50 years. The increased daily record is largely due to our increased tracing and testing capacity, which is mainly as a result of the increased community mobilization and awareness creation. The Federal Ministry of Health, through the Nigeria Center for Disease Control, has developed subnational risk-based decision-making metrics for risk level assessments at state and local government areas. The NCDC has trained first aid workers for all religious groups in Gombe State and supported screening of our Almajiris coming into Jigawa State. Yesterday, we joined the rest of the global community to commemorate World Hypertension Day, to educate the public and laboratory consumables be sent to Kano to ensure the sustenance of the testing capacity. The annual World Health Assembly, held every year in Geneva, begins today, the 18th day of May, and is presently ongoing. The World Health Assembly holds this year for the first time by teleconference. and is being attended virtually by the Honorable Minister of Health, Dr. Ihanire. The focus of the meeting expectedly is the global spread and response to COVID-19. Finally, I shall reiterate again the importance of adhering to public health advisories, wearing of face masks, observing social and physical distancing, practicing hand washing or sanitizing using alcohol-based sanitizer, standard respiratory hygiene, avoiding crowds, and all non-essential travels. The importance of these and similar measures is such that compliance should be taken as a civic duty, an obligation for every citizen, where each should be responsible for the order. As such, enforcement or policing should ordinarily not be necessary for what is meant to preserve life and health. Therefore, I call for considerate attitude and social adjustment to the challenges we face at this moment. I thank you for listening.
So, Chairman, Presidential Task Force, Honorable Ministers for Health, ladies and gentlemen of the media. I thought today to start from where the SGF stopped in reflecting on the visit and guidance by Mr. President over the weekend. Of course, Mr. President started by thanking all of us and all healthcare workers and everybody across the country that have been working very hard over the past 4 months now in responding to this outbreak. He then interrogated us in detail about all aspects of the response. And we went through the details of efforts being made by all sectors in driving the response. But I guess what touched me the most was where he ended up after that. He asked us about the impact the restrictions we're having on ordinary Nigerians, the impact it's had on farmers and people going back to farm, the impact it's had on small and medium-scale enterprises, and the millions of Nigerians that go out every day to earn their living. He reminded us on our social economic circumstances in Nigeria and what we are able to do as a government and what we are not able to do, and why we had to reinvigorate our efforts to get this outbreak under some level of control so that people can get back to their livelihoods, recognizing how important those livelihoods are, particularly in our own context. And then we reviewed the restrictions and where we were and the level of compliance. And we reached a consensus that we will have to live with this for a few weeks, months, into the foreseeable future. But how do we do this safely, was his question. And the question that we all have to grapple with as a community. How do we restart our economies safely? How do we move from the narrative of a lockdown to a narrative of a safe reopening, so that people can go back to their livelihoods while still staying safe as possible from this virus? How do we do that in the farms? How do we do that in the markets? How do we do that in the schools? How do we do that in transport? How do we do that in aviation? And really, this has to be our focus in the next few weeks. How does the small kiosk owner down the road manage his business in a safe way and realize that in planning for that, he can find a way to be safe but also to restart his business. How can the barber shop restart his barbing business? How can the services that the salons restart their businesses safely? There are no easy answers to any of these, and the answers cannot all come from NCDC or from any of us. We can provide very broad guidance, but I was happy to hear the efforts being made by the aviation industry, the detailed thinking that has started to happen in order to eventually restart. Similar conversations are going on in education. I've been privy to some of that. It will be much easier for Mr. President in 2 weeks' time if we go back to him, not with a narrative of do I open a lockdown or not, but with a narrative that in the event that we are ready, that the time has come, this is the preparation we have made as an industry. These are the new guidelines we have come up with in order to reopen safely. This will make his decision a lot easier. But it's not just the big industries. The aviation industry, the education sector are very well regulated contexts. So it's a little bit easier to make those decisions. I think the hardest questions for all of us would be how do we make our small and medium-scale enterprises, where we can't regulate every man that sells recharge cards on the roads, every small kiosk, every small barber. How do we make those businesses safe for all of us? And that is where the term taking responsibility goes beyond a catchphrase. It really is about how do we do this collectively. So next time you go out and walk down your street to sit down by the kiosk down the street, engage with the kiosk owner and have a discussion, because not everyone really has come to terms with why a small invisible virus has stopped the entire economy. It's very difficult for people to understand what is going on. This is not like crime or electricity or any of the other things that are more visualizable. For many people, they still doubt what is going on because it's difficult to explain why microorganisms are causing an entire economy to stop. So we need all of us to re-engage with our populations, our people, our churches, our communities, our mosques, our businesses, our schools, our transporters, whoever we are communicating with, is how do we plan for the new world for now? How do we plan and engage to live safely with COVID-19? This is really at the heart of what Mr. President was thinking and talking about as we met him this weekend. And it should drive our own thinking conversations as we plan on how to manage the next 2 weeks as we continue in phase one, but really then plan for how to reopen the rest of the economy safely. Thank you very much.
The Chairman, Presidential Task Force, members of the PTF, ladies and gentlemen of the press, good evening. My theme today will be on addressing fake news. We have noted a growing incidence of fake news, and this is particularly associated with the government's COVID emergency response. And there's no doubt that these kinds of incorrect and manufactured news distract and misinform the public, as well as discredit the national response effort. Examples of fake news around activities of the task force include false statements about the lockdown guidelines, as well as false reports on relief funds received or spent by the PTF. There's no doubt that the impact of fake news can be quite considerable. It damages the credibility of the nation's COVID response, particularly when these stories are circulated as unconfirmed facts. It also harms the fragile trust between the government and the public, resulting potentially in people acting on wrong information. Our call to you today is to please make sure that when you or your loved ones have received messages on any platform, we urge you to please verify the source and authenticity before forwarding these messages. There are verifiable sources as far as the COVID response is concerned. One of those sources include the meeting we are having today, this daily press briefing, where both the PTF and key stakeholders provide live updates on response activities and provide a platform for two-way communication between the media and ourselves. There are also other sources of fact, such as government agencies, including the agencies that sit on the PTF, our own websites of the NCDC and SGF, the Federal Ministry of Information, as well as other government agencies. We also issue press statements from time to time from the various PTF agencies. Any COVID response information not verified through any of these channels should really be scrutinized. We enjoin you to always verify the source and authenticity of news before you share with your friends and loved ones. Let us please help to promote a narrative of truth and facts. We should verify before sharing. And to those that are engaged in this activity, we urge you to channel your energy to more productive endeavors. There's no doubt spreading falsehood damages our communities, it damages trust, and absolutely undermines the work we are trying to do in controlling this pandemic. From the point of view of easing the lockdown, as the chairman said, we have completed the first phase of the ease lockdown as directed by Mr. President. We are extending, so all the guidelines that we have stated in relation to phase 1 continue. We have analyzed the first phase. There will be minor changes that will happen, but these changes will not be significantly altered in terms of what we expect over the next 2 weeks, apart from the issue of enforcement. In addition to that, we will be working more closely with the states to get closer to the communities and ensure effective engagement, so that some of these guidelines can be, people can comply with them voluntarily based on the knowledge of risks that we have provided them, rather than trying to enforce people to change their behavior. I'll be providing further information over the coming days with regards to the implementation guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take updates from the Honorable Minister of Aviation, Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, Honorable Minister of Information and Culture in successive order. Minister of Aviation, please.
Mr. Chairman and members of the task force, gentlemen of the media, good afternoon. There's a very quick brief. A slight change in the procedure that we approve flights. This time around, once we receive any request for a flight, we would get in touch quickly with the focal person at the point of entry to see whether there is quarantine space available before that flight is given approval. Those details, I'm sure, will come in the briefing by the national coordinator. But this will be done electronically as usual through WhatsApp or email, and then it will be as speedy as it used to be. Certainly it wouldn't have any significant time lost. Secondly, there is this lingering issue on the relationship or business relationship between two entities, SACOL and NACO Aviance, and the clearing agents. And they're drawn parallel with what happens in the maritime industry. There's a slight difference between what is obtained in aviation and that in the maritime industry. The Nigerian Port Authority concessioned their ports into private operators, and they're making money out of it. And whatever demurrage charges, Nigerian Port Authority shares in that demurrage. So it is within their powers to be able to grant waivers on those kind of demurrages. In the case of civil aviation, it used to be owned by Nigeria Airways, but it was sold to private entity. So also NACO Aviation is private entity. So the relationship it is between business and business, between the clearing agents and those two entities. FAN, Federal Airport Authority of Nigeria, does not share in the revenue from demurrage. Nothing goes to them at all. They are not in a position, neither us, to enforce a waiver on those charges. However, as regulators of the industry and a very responsible government MDA, we thought that we should intervene and try to see what we can do to bring peace and to promote those businesses, both businesses. And that resulted in the two companies giving 80% waiver of the demurrage charges and still negotiating on the 20%. It is the intent of government to continue to intervene to get to perhaps zero demurrage in due course, believing that aviation being the worst hit, whatever palliatives that will come from government certainly will come to aviation. And if that happens, then, of course, based on the criteria that we set out for government, every aviation entrepreneur and companies and businesses would share from that if it happens. And we're very confident that government notes the situation in aviation, which is very pathetic. It is the worst hit. We're bleeding. As I speak to you, even agencies of government are not able to pay their salaries. So we will be alive to our responsibility, I assure you, and I'm very confident that the issue of demurrage will be as it is practiced in the maritime industry. Then there is an issue of a company called FlyJet. I want to apologize that when I tweeted, perhaps it was late in the afternoon and the fasting was biting harder. We referred to it as Aviation. The correct name is FlyJet, and it's a UK registered company. They have an aircraft, the Legacy 600, and the registration number of the aircraft is G for Golf, P for Papa, R for Romeo, F for Foxtrot, and X for X-ray. That is the company registration, or the aircraft registration number. And their business address is a Business Aviation Center, Terminal Road, Birmingham International Airport, West Midlands. And the code is B for Bravo, 26, 3, Q for Quebec, and N for November. This company applied a couple of times, severally actually, to us to operate humanitarian flights, and which we did approve. And it is very, very clear at the beginning of this exercise. We define what those kind of flights should be. Essential flights, basically. Cargo, medical evacuation, medical supplies, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, this company turned to become commercial in their service. They were charging money to fly people in and out. In the first place, we believe that the whole essence of a lockdown is to ensure that there is no movement of persons freely. Because this COVID-19 we're all here for, we're all spending sleepless nights for, happened because someone traveled and brought it in. So if you want to catch fish, empty the water. So we believe that by being the lockdown and stopping all these flights, with all of the consequences that it's bringing to us, is to prevent people from moving freely. So this shouldn't happen. Current status, We are investigating the matter right now. It will finish very soon. The pilots will be subjected to 14-day quarantine at the moment while investigation goes on. The aircraft is impounded in Lagos. And the crew are British nationals, like we said, and the company, Flyjet, is a UK company. And we will keep you posted as developments, and like I said also, whatever is there as in our laws will be applied to the fullest. Thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Chairman, members of the PTF, ladies and gentlemen, members of the press, good evening. I briefed you, of course, last week regarding the situation of evacuees. And, of course, one that has got a lot of mileage in social media especially has been the costs that we've had to impose on prospective evacuees to cover their hotel and feeding and other costs. We had to do this because we just do not have the funding. The first 3 sets of evacuees, we used funding that was actually meant for something else in the hope that we might get some funding to continue. And that funding dried up. And so we found ourselves in the situation where either we stopped evacuations for lack of funding, but we knew that there were so many people who were desperate to get back, or we passed on the costs to the evacuees. But what I did say was that I would spare no effort in trying to source for funding from whatever source we could find it, and that would be an ongoing process. And so, Friday night, after getting all the barrage from around the world, including that we were somehow conspiring with hotels to fleece Nigerians and make money for ourselves and other kinds of accusations, we continued nevertheless to try to find a way through. And they say that 2 heads are better than 1. And the Honorable Minister of Environment on Friday night, Dr. Mohammed Abubakar Mahmoud, called me and said, look, listen, I really sympathize with you in this situation, in this challenge, and I think let's work together, let's try and come up with a solution. And he suggested, and I can never thank him enough, that why not try NNPC? Why not try CBN? They have corporate social responsibility funding and so forth. And it was, a light bulb. And I told him I would do that immediately. And got in touch with the governor of the CBN and used as much persuasive charm as possible to get him over. And told him that I was going to do the same with NNPC, with the GMD of NNCC, Mele Kyari. And the governor of the central bank very generously, very kindly, and agreed that he said the amount that I was talking about, over ₦1 billion, because we have about 4,000 Nigerians out there, and if even 3,000 and something of them come back, the cost of accommodation, feeding, and everything else is over ₦1 billion that we don't have. And he said he was ready to explore and share the costs with CBN, with NNPC, and I spoke to the GMD of NNPC, and he said he was going to consult. And so, kept fingers crossed. And thanks be to God, today he got back to me to say he was ready. He was going to meet up with the governor of the central bank, and that together they would fund this portion, a very, very important portion, the accommodation and feeding of evacuees, so we can, go forward in a better environment. And as I said, one was receiving messages. The last one I got, a lady in India that was pleading. She was there with her husband, and that the additional cost for accommodation and so forth would just make it impossible for them to get back. So I would, really like to, well, first and foremost, thank the Honourable Minister of Environment, the solidarity and the idea, and also the Group Managing Director of NNPC and the Governor of the CBN, and above all, President Muhammadu Buhari, who has given them the opening and the possibility to be able to come in and support Nigerians in a desperate situation around the world. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman and members of the PTF COVID-19, gentlemen of the media, I want to bring to your attention the results of the latest NOI poll on COVID-19, which was conducted this month. Please note that the last NOI poll was conducted in March. On awareness, the level of awareness across the country about COVID-19, according to the new poll, is now above 99%, meaning nearly all Nigerians are aware of the disease. On immunity, whereas 28% of respondents said they believe they are immune to COVID-19 in March, the figure has now dropped to 26%. On preventive measures, the poll reveals that 91% of respondents said they are aware of the different preventive measures, such as hand washing, which is now at 87%, up by 10%. Use of face masks is now at 85%, up by 22%. And social distancing is now at 55%, up by 43%. On stigmatization, these have remained a concern. In the March poll, 81% said they are willing to work with people who recover from COVID-19. However, that figure has now dropped to 78% in the current poll. On the ease of lockdown, 57% Nigerians support the easing of the lockdown announced in April, while 29% did not support. On risk communication, 95% said they have seen or heard advertising, publicity, or any other types of information from government about COVID-19. 71% said they feel they are getting the information they need from government on COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister of Information and Culture. That brings us to the end of the updates segment. We shall now take your questions.
Chairman, members of the task force, my colleagues, my name is Amaka Ude. I report for Arise News. And my first question actually goes to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Well, sir, I remember before we started evacuating Nigerians stock abroad, you had given us the guidelines they have to adhere to before they are part of those who would come back home. And you told us they have to provide a test result that they are COVID-19 negative. I want to know if that has changed. The reason why I ask this is because over the weekend, the Commissioner for Health in Lagos did tell us that 3 out of those who returned from Dubai tested positive for COVID-19. And my next question really, thank God she's here, the WHO. Well, over the weekend, there was a communique that your organization released as it concerns disinfection and decontamination of public places. And you said this is not helping to deal with COVID-19. And I do know that the Minister of Environment here have actually conducted some decontamination of some public places. So we'd like to get more clarifications on that. And finally, okay, back to the Minister of Health. It's about Nigerians in India. They say there's an Air India plane coming into Nigeria on the 1st of June. So they want to know if you are negotiating with them because the plane is coming in empty, if you do the same like you did for the Nigerians who were evacuated from the UK. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Friday Okerigbe. I'm a reporter with Channels TV. I would like to ask my first question, and I'll appreciate it if the PTF chairman can actually respond to it. Why the federal government response team is extending the relaxation by 2 weeks. Many states have already lifted some of these bans already. I noticed that in your remarks you talked about the need to work with the states. I would like to know specifically what strategy that the PTF is going to adopt this time around to ensure that the states and the federal government will be singing the same song, will not be having a discordant voice as it concerns the relaxation. Because some states, as we speak, they've opened up worship centers. Some are even considering opening up schools, but that is not the case at the federal level. And closely related to that too is what happened, I don't want to mention the name of a state, but what happened during the weekend when a state governor invited scientists to his state. And what came out of the conference that day was that the scientists were telling the citizens in the state that COVID-19 is a scam. As incredible and sometimes unfortunate as that may seem, many people will want to believe those people, whom, of course, they refer to as scientists. So the question now is, what strategy is the PTF really going to adopt to ensure that such information coming from high-placed people like that are actually countered? Then my second question will actually go to the WHO. Some time ago, you told us on this platform that the WHO has the Solidarity Trial Program, and Nigeria is part of it. We were also told that about 5 states have already, in Nigeria, are already participating in the clinical trials of some of these. I would like to know how soon are we going to expect drugs or vaccine to COVID-19? Thank you.
Good evening, the SGF, Honorable Minister, the DG, NCDC, and my colleagues. My name is Rahila Lassa. I report for Voice of Nigeria. My first question or concern goes to the Chairman, PTF. Today's papers are awash with complaints from the police, especially those manning the interstate borders, that they have not been given PPEs and no allowances, which makes the job very, very risky for them. So I want to know how the PTF can intervene to rescue the situation. Secondly, this goes to the State Minister for Education. We've received several calls from parents of students in SS3 who want to know if NECO exams will hold first week of June as speculated. Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the PTF. My first question goes to the coordinator. Sir, last week the National Judicial Council gave guidelines for court sittings to resume nationwide. With interstate travel ban, how can judges, lawyers, and litigants travel to attend cases? Are you going to include them in the exemption list, or is there any particular thing they need to do to attend, if they have to travel to attend to court cases? The DG NCDC, sir, the Minister of Foreign Affairs just told us no funds to feed and accommodate evacuees, even though the CBN has come to their aid. I want to ask, have you abandoned the idea of self-isolating at home completely? If the UK, US, and other climes, evacuees self-isolate at their homes under strict supervision, why can't Nigeria do the same? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, sir, members of the PTF, my colleagues, good afternoon. My name is Nancy Oyedia Orum from AIT. I think the Minister of Foreign Affairs answered a bit of my question, 40%, but the 60% of the question goes to the SDF. Sir, on Friday you told us that the PTF has an account that is being handled by the Accountant General of the Federation, and what the PTF does only is, if there's anything to do, they write a budget and this money is released. So this is just like Oliver Twist for some people who are also stranded abroad. They are appealing to the PTF. Is there a way with your position you can include the plight of some of these people in that budget so that just to help some of them? And secondly, sir, the issue of human rights violation is becoming appalling. Now, the last time I was here, so I talked about violation of a journalist here in the FCT, but we haven't heard anything about that. Now, there was a case in Jos where a young boy of 20 years was shot by security personnel. Yes, the Nigerian army have come up to say it was a mistake, but some of these people are appealing to the PTF to do something about it, because this happened during the lockdown. So it brings me to my question, sir. I've asked before, if you can engage with security personnel, you made the assurance that you are going to talk to some of the security agencies. I want to get an update on that so that we can reduce this issue of human rights violation. Mr. DG, sir, so you gave us an assurance that in about 3 months we'll be testing 2 million Nigerians. And we're almost coasting to the 2nd month, and Nigeria is still doing about 35,000 testing. I don't know, that assurance, is this feasible? Thank you.
Good afternoon, sirs. My name is Hassan Umar Farouk. I report for Liberty Radio and Television. Tambaya ta zuwa ga sakataren gwamnatin tarayya ne. Ka ɗauki lokaci wajen bayanin irin dogon tunani da gwamnati ta yi kafin ƙara mako 2 na dokar zaman gida. Murna ta koma ciki a jihar Kano a lokacin da suke tunanin sallar Idi ta taho kila akwai sassauci. Zan so in ka yi bayani a cikin harshen Hausa wace hikima ke da kwai wajen ƙara sati 2 a jihar Kano a lokacin da waɗanda suka kamu da cutar suka fi yawa a jihar Lagos. Na gode.
Good evening, everybody. Rachel Abuja from the News Agency of Nigeria. My first question is to the DG NCDC. Sir, we now have 26 labs in our network of testing, which is kind of commendable, and I know we're expecting like 3 more. I would like to know the technicians, if we have the right technicians to scale for those labs or the machines in 28 states, if we have them on board. And meanwhile, I don't know what the NCDC will be doing to ensure that we have proper reassuring or resourcing for those capacity to work in the country. My next question is for the WHO rep. Just last week, CDC said multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children appears to be associated with COVID-19. I would like to know your recommendation or what you'll be advising Nigerians in the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, I don't know, Ma, if you would still like to explain in details. Somebody sent this question in. Asymptomatic patients and what happens when someone carries the virus more than unusual. Thank you very much.
Good evening, Chairman, PTF, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chukwemeka Okerafo, and I'm here for Stay Safe Nigeria. So I have a question for the Chairman. The lockdown has been extended for 2 weeks. Previously, there have been reports of a lot of interstate travels, which simply connotes porosity of our interstate borders. With this extension by 2 weeks, what arrangement is in place with the security agencies to ensure that interstate travels is enforced based on what we've seen from the past? What are specific arrangements to make sure that this is, enforced? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we take the responses, may I emphasize that only accredited journalists are allowed to come up to the mic and ask questions here. If you're not accredited, you're not supposed to be in this hall because we are maintaining the gathering of a fixed number. You will please have to excuse us at this point. You have to go out of this hall. Thank you. We'll still take your questions nevertheless. Questions have come in. They are directed at the Honorable Minister of Health, the DG NCDC, the National Coordinator, the WHO rep, the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honorable Minister of State Education, and the SGF. We shall begin, as usual, with the Honorable Minister of Health. Was there no question for Minister of Health? Okay. Okay, DG NCDC.
So thank you. I think there were 3 questions for us. The first one was on self-isolation. I think very early in the outbreak, we had a policy of self-isolation for people that came back, traveled back to Nigeria from one of the most affected countries. But since then, the policy has been institutional isolation, both for people being brought back through the evacuation processes at the moment. If that changes, we're all constantly reviewing this policy, but that's the policy at the moment. Yes, other countries are doing different things, but this is what we have agreed to do within the PTF for now, and that's the policy of the federal government of Nigeria through the Presidential Task Force. Secondly, yes, we did put an ambitious target of hitting 2 million tests in 3 months. This is beginning of week 3, if I am not mistaken. So we're not in the 2nd month yet. We're in the 3rd week. So, sometimes to drive improvement, you have to set hard targets for yourself. And that is really what we've done. The improvement of testing is really, there are many bottlenecks to this. And that's something throughout this weekend. We were working with our global partners in terms of how to unbottle some of those supply chain challenges. And some of those things are now going to yield fruit this week. I actually don't want to name a date until I have those reagents in country. So I'm hesitant to say this is when it will happen or that is when it will happen. But I know the reagents, there's now a lot of momentum around supplying us with those reagents that will really lead us to that. The other thing is, how do we stimulate more collection of samples from people? And like I said, we will publish the number of tests per state. This we promised to do today. We might end up doing it tomorrow. But this will be published so that you can see that it's not just the testing in the lab. You will see actually from those numbers that there are many states that don't have a lab that have tested an incredible number of people compared to the total figure. So we'll discuss those numbers once we make them available either later today or tomorrow. Finally, there was a question on activating labs. When you're building an institution, there are many things that are never visible to people. So when we came to NCDC 4 years ago, we realized that there were several pieces of laboratory equipment lying across the country that were not functioning. Why were they not functioning? Maybe for one small component or one small problem, and you'll be wasting equipment worth millions of naira or millions of dollars sometimes. So we started looking for how to train our biomedical engineers. We found a partner in JICA. JICA is a Japanese International Cooperation Agency, and they started supporting us specifically in this regard. We have now trained 2 biomedical engineers over 6 months in Japan. Japan is well known worldwide for their capacity around things like this. These 2 colleagues are leading a lot of the efforts on the equipment side of activating labs. Then, of course, we will have our normal, well, not normal, we have our biomedical laboratory scientists, medical laboratory scientists that are leading the training on the laboratory diagnostic side. So when we send the team is typically made up of 3 people: a biomedical engineer, a molecular scientist, a molecular laboratory scientist, and 1 new colleague to be trained in the process. So these are the teams. We now have 2 teams left today, 1 to Katsina and 1 to Ilorin, to do this. And as we continue to do this, we build the capacity of more Nigerians to do this. So the maintenance of medical equipment is one of the biggest challenges we have. We're focusing on the laboratory side, but anybody working in the health space will tell you the challenges that we have with very expensive pieces of medical equipment that often break down for one small problem. And that's the challenge we're trying to solve. There's no magic bullet. You keep pushing, you train. We have a workshop at NCDC now where you train our local colleagues in order to do a lot of the maintenance. What we call biosafety cabinets that are necessary, they have to be accredited every single year. They have to be checked whether they still provide the safe environment to enable people work safely. So to do that, the people certifying them have to themselves be certified that they can certify the cabinet. So it's a very diligent process in keeping our equipment working, because we know that that equipment is what ultimately leads us to having confidence in the results that we produce. So I think, yes, the answer is yes, we do have people doing this, and we try to keep them within the public sector, which is not always easy. But I think people are beginning to realize that there is benefit in working in the public sector, and they can grow their careers that way. So thank you.
I think I have a few questions. I'll start first of all with the issue of the Nigeria Judicial Council and the instructions to start working, and whether we're going to be giving passes to people attending court cases. Every case will be decided on an individual basis. Government offices are still working at reduced capacity. We expect only staff from grade levels 14 upwards will continue to attend. So we will take decisions based on an individual basis rather than a collective basis. In terms of the question on the lack of harmony between the federal government response and the state response team, I just wanted to say that we are closely aligned with the Nigeria Governance Forum. In fact, today, prior to this meeting, the chairman had a discussion with the head of the Nigeria Governance Forum. We will continue to work through the community engagement teams. We have activated a lot of the structures at the community level. And moving on to the next phase, our intention is to start giving more and more leeway to state governments to take decisions with regards to the response. It will not be driven primarily at the federal level beyond the next few weeks. We expect states to start taking more and more responsibility for this, especially as we start looking at hotspots. What we do know is up to 50% of all the infections in the country are happening in a few local governments across the country. And that will be our approach. But we can only deal with this if we work closely with the state governments. In terms of the issue of What strategies are we applying to ensure that Nigerians are properly informed, particularly if there are situations where people don't believe that COVID exists? Well, our view really is that we all we all have personal responsibility for our health and for the health of our loved ones and our community. There is no doubt that COVID exists. 315,000 persons have died globally from COVID. It is not a scientific, it's not an issue of the world creating a spectacle in order to just derive certain benefit. There's no doubt this is a true pandemic. It's a situation that is new to our generation. It has affected countries and economies. So when it comes to denial, I'm afraid I'm afraid really the issue is we have to take responsibility, and it's the role of government to make sure that their citizens are safe. So promoting ideas that give impression that COVID does not exist is definitely unhelpful. We'll continue to work closely, particularly with community leaders, traditional institutions, religious authorities, to make sure that the guidelines that we provide, basically to make people safe, are complied with. Other issues have to do with allowances for security people. We are currently processing this. We've been awaiting paperwork. The paperwork needs to be complete before we go ahead to pay. And with regards to PPE, I know we distributed some PPEs to frontline non-health workers last week, but all agencies, a lot of the agencies that deal with security, etc., do have within their budget lines for PPE, and we expect them to go ahead and procure the PPEs using their budget lines. Human rights abuses, we have been meeting on a weekly basis with the security chiefs. We discuss a lot of the human rights issues that have been coming up. Of course, as we all know, this is not new to COVID alone. It's been an issue that has been lingering for quite a while across different sectors, and we'll continue to engage the security chiefs to make them aware of the importance of respecting people's rights, and for those that are allowed free movement, to allow them to get on with their work and with their lives. Thank you.
The Chair and members of the PTF, thank you for the questions that have been posed. I think I had 4 questions. Starting off with the new guidance that WHO released on 15th of May related to cleaning of surfaces in the environment as well as healthcare settings. Just to highlight some of the components of that guidance, which really state that we do have studies that have evaluated the persistence of COVID-19 virus on different surfaces: cloth, plastic, wood, stainless steel, and so on. And we also know that we have environmental surfaces in healthcare settings, and these surfaces in the healthcare settings are more likely to be contaminated given the existence of patients in these settings. So the new guidance is really intended for healthcare professionals to guide on the recommendations for cleaning of these surfaces, and it does not in any way discourage the importance of cleaning surfaces outside healthcare settings. The detailed guidance note is available on the WHO website. The second question relates to what's the timeline we can expect for drugs for the COVID treatment. As we have mentioned, it is a large multi-country effort that is going on across several countries globally. And we are picking up on that trial in Nigeria. Some sites have started, some are yet to start. The whole idea is that the large pool of information across the countries will be systematically analyzed at the global level, in addition to what is coming in from the other countries, carefully analyzed, and then guidance provided to countries on which formulation is more effective. I want to highlight these are not new drugs that we are trying. These are drugs that we have had available, but they are simply being repurposed for the intention of determining their effect on the COVID virus. So it is a process, and we will continue to keep you updated on what the timeline will look like, but we are still quite early in the process in collection of the data. The third question relates to the multisystem inflammatory disorder that has been observed among children and adolescents. Want to note that overall we have relatively few cases of COVID-19 confirmed in infants, confirmed in children, and those that get infected experience mild symptoms. However, recently we've received reports from Europe and North America that have described clusters of children and adolescents requiring admission to intensive care units with a multi-system inflammatory disorder, which has some features similar to those of Kawasaki disease and toxic shock syndrome. The case reports have described the presentation of an acute illness accompanied by a hyperinflammatory syndrome that eventually leads to organ failure and shock. So it's essential to characterize the syndrome, its risk factors, understand the causality and what can be done about it. And in this regard, WHO has developed a preliminary case definition and case report for this multisystem inflammatory disorder in children and adolescents. And it's to try and collect information systematically from countries that are observing this, and to provide more information to the public on whether we see this as a real linkage and what exactly is the cause, what are the risk factors, and the appropriate management. The final question is around the what happens when someone carries virus more than usual. I think that what we normally do for confirmation of cases, and nasopharyngeal swab is obtained, and we're able to determine the viral load levels. And once a patient starts on the management, clinical management in a facility, over time you can measure the viral load. Essentially, once a certain threshold is reached with subsequent tests, then you are regarded as negative. So this is the sort of sequential process, and that is why we need to conduct the tests more than once to determine the levels of the viral load as you move forward. So that remains our way of management. You might find in rare cases that the virus may persist, and we still need to continue observing the patient and keeping the necessary precautions to avoid transmission of the virus. But usually we expect that after the 14 days that will be at the level where the virus is no longer detected through the lab testing that we do. So it is very rare that we'll see some cases that this exceeds. Most of the patients do recover, and as you know, majority of the cases that we see are really mild or asymptomatic cases, and should be able to recover well after a period of 2 weeks. Thank you.
of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you. The first question I received was on test results for evacuees, and that 3 of the evacuees from Dubai in Lagos had tested positive. What actually makes the case, the medical case that our medical people told us, is actually shown by this. Because with Emirates, they have a mandatory testing system before they board the flight. And so they were tested. And our medical experts told us that it was not necessary to test beforehand. And I think that this proves it, because you know, the period of gestation or whatever, you know, is not one that can be necessarily seen immediately. So even if you test, you know, it could only start showing some days after the flight, for instance. So it's not a foolproof way. And what we have maintained is the sort of the standard temperature test and close observations and so forth. So I think that the positive cases in Lagos actually goes to show, since they were tested, that you know, testing beforehand is no guarantee whatsoever. And the second question was in respect of Air India that's coming. Well, first of all, the date hasn't been approved yet by us. We have an approval system before flights can come in, bringing evacuees. And we also want to now space out the times between planes coming in, just because our capacity is being stretched. But the other point, again, in respect of that, is that we are, as much as possible, trying to use Nigerian carriers to bring back evacuees. And we know for a fact that there actually is a Nigerian carrier in talks with the Nigerian High Commission in India to bring back evacuees from India. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will skip the Honorable Minister of State Education and go straight to the Chairman, PTF, SGF, sir.
There were no questions about schools? Okay. I think one of the questions that was directed at me was the issue of the collaborative way we are working with state governors. And I think my address did dwell quite extensive on that this afternoon. I spoke about the fact that even this morning I attended a meeting in which the chairman of the Governors Forum, along with their representatives from all the 6 geopolitical zones, were in attendance with Mr. President. And we did discuss, and like I reflected in my address, that the discussion was centered on the need to further deepen our collaboration. And I think we are not working in silos. We are working all in the same frame of the national response. We've said it repeatedly that we are running a federation, and the subnationals, even from the address of Mr. President on the 27th, did acknowledge that. but did also draw their attentions to the fact that whatever they are going to in place as part of the processes of this response, it must align with the national response. So I don't think there are discordant voices. And that emphasis was also drawn from my remarks this afternoon when I said in paragraph 13 that in the interest of our nation, the role of the states and the local governments remain critical to our success. The national response will remain a national response until we deepen it by our interaction with the states and the local governments. And I said the PTF shall engage with the states on the effective implementation of these guidelines. Went further to state the fact that this morning I participated in a virtual conference between the President and the Nigerian Governors Forum, and the subject of collaboration was robustly discussed. As a matter of fact, I looked into my file and I picked the agenda and I saw the items they brought for discussion. One was the interstate boundary restriction. They were very, very categorical on that, that we must insist on enforcement on interstate boundary restrictions, because they attribute most of the infections in their states to infections that have been seeded as a result of travels. And that was why I drew their attention. And the Mr. President had directed that we work with them quite closely to ensure that there is a total enforcement of interstate travels, except for those items and the kind of travels that have been exempted. The second thing they raised was the issue of public gatherings, which was referred to in the question. And they said, as a governors forum, their policy is that all gatherings should be within a defined number. And that has been consistently our policy even at the PTF, and which was approved for the first guidelines of the first phase, which we are maintaining. All public gatherings, except in workplaces, should not exceed 20. Implementation at the state level sometimes can vary, provided the other processes or the other protocols that we have put in place, like social distancing, wearing of masks, keeping personal hygiene by washing of hands or using sanitizers, and those public places too should provide for those things. Provided those things are in place, we think we are working together. As a federation, we acknowledge that there are variants in the implementation, but all are cued into ensuring that the national response remain one and remain positive. The other question has to deal with the allowances. That has been answered. Allowances that have been approved, allowances that are supposed to be paid, would have to go through some processes. You remember we reported to you that there's an MOU that has been signed with even the frontline medical workers as regard allowances. That too is in process. You take a decision on an allowance today, it is not affected the next day. It goes through processes. There are some documentations that would accompany those kind of processes before payments are done. So I believe the national coordinator has responded to that adequately. Human rights violation. Last week, the Executive Secretary of the Human Rights Commission reported himself at a press conference that there has been a substantial decrease on human rights violations. So if there is a decrease, it means that some engagements are taking place that is necessitating those decrease. I can tell you that we have met with the security operatives about 5 times since this process began, culminating with the meeting that we had at the National Security Council last week. So everybody within the security and intelligence network is very much aware of where we stand. And my address even this afternoon referred to the fact that in the enforcement of these protocols, security and our lead agency, the police, must be mindful of respecting the human rights of our citizens. But in the same vein, the citizens too have a responsibility to try as much as possible to respect those protocols and to respect the officers that are deployed to provide for our safety and our protection. I think it's a two-way thing. You respect the rights of the citizens. In turn, the officers to have a right to demand that when they are enforcing these laws, some measures of respect is accorded to them. That way we would avoid situations of unhealthy developments. Like I said, we've met up with them about 5 times. We will continue to engage them. Even in the processes of the extension of the ease on the lockdown, we would engage them because there is going to be a vigorous pursuit in enforcement of the protocols. In the last 2 weeks, in all the conferences that we've had, we've mentioned the fact that compliance has been very low. And the only way we can get out of the woods and achieve all the objectives that we have set, compliance is cardinal. Kano, yes, there has been an extension. I will answer in English, then I will go to Hausa. There has been an extension of the situation in Kano. And the Liberty television reporter that asked the question said, well, Lagos has more numbers. Where is there an extension in Kano and not in Lagos? The fact of the matter is that Lagos was under a lockdown of 5 weeks. Lagos, Ogun, and FCT were locked down for 5 weeks before the introduction of the ease on the lockdown that started on the 4th of May. The presidential lockdown on Kano has just been 2 weeks. We are starting another set of 2 weeks. Simple reason, we do not want Kano figures to escalate and be in competition with the figures in Lagos. And the only way you can do that is to reduce and interrupt the processes of community transmission that was hitherto in Kano, unknown even to the health facilities in Kano. Because Kano came with a boom. It started with 1 figure. The next day, it didn't go to 2, 3 like other places. It was a blown out figure. An indication of the fact that community transmission had already started long before the index case in Kano was established. And the only way you can interrupt that is to slow down the interactions of people in the city and all over the state. These are not designed to be punitive measures. They are designed to save lives. Kano is the first state where we have the task team that went there has to deal with an issue of verbal autopsy because of the number of unidentified cause of death that was recorded. So you can see the complex nature of the situation in Kano, and it requires a drastic process to be able to resolve the issues surrounding Kano. So I believe that the Kano people will have that at the back of their mind, and they would understand that this is not meant to interrupt their social life, it's not meant to punish them, but it is meant to safeguard lives and protect them from further infections and transmissions within the city. As we build capacity to ensure that we provide enough bed space for isolation, we do a lot of the contact tracing, because there is a point that when it gets to the level of community transmission that is exponential, contact tracing doesn't even make sense, because virtually everybody you will come across must have been in contact with one infected person or the other. We want to make sure that we interrupt that process. And it's an interruption of that process that can slow down the speed at which the community transmission is going on. I believe we would appeal to the understanding. We are very sensitive to the nature of the time now, the holy month of Ramadan, and the need for people to exercise their faith. But in these very difficult moments, we also appeal to them to have an understanding for the good of their people, their loved ones, and their state. Tambayan da aka yi bisan maganan Kano akan cewa mutanen da suke dauke da wannan cuta a Kano ba su kai yawan mutanen da suke a Lagos ba, me yasa kuma aka sake ba da sati biyu na lockdown na Kano? To dalilin da yasa aka yi haka, Lagos ta yi sati 5 tana lockdown, Kano ta yi sati 2 ne yanzu wanda federal government ta sa. Kafin lokacin hukumar jiha ta sa nata abubuwa na kokarin yadda za ta maganta wannan batun ciwon coronavirus din nan. Amma na federal government yanzu an kara sati 2 ne don a tabbatar ma'aikatu da testing da neman mutanen da suka hadu da waɗanda suka kamu da cutar nan an yi shi a cikin wannan lokaci. Mun sani akan cewa yanzu lokacin azumi ne, kuma an kai kusan karshen azumi, za a shiga batun sallah. Muna roka mutanen Kano su yi hakuri, wannan abubuwan nan da aka sa dinnan ba don a tozata masu bane, an sa don kyautata mutanen Kano ne, a tabbatar kuma an rage waɗanda za su kamu da waɗannan cututtuka. Ina roko a wannan lokaci a samu wannan fahimta, kuma a hakuri da gwamnati, kuma a ba gwamnati goyon baya, don wannan cutan in ba mutum yana haɗuwa da mutum ba, bayan da za ka kamu da wannan cutan. A wannan lokaci kuma don mun bari kawai ana yawo ana haɗuwa, cutar za ta daɗa yaduwa. Kuma an ga irin mutuwan da aka ta yi a Kano a kwanakin bayan da ya wuce, wanda ma ba san dalilin da ya sa mutanen nan suka mutu ba. Yanzu ne muke kokari mu tabbatar corona ne ko wani cututtuka ne, don mu tabbatar akan cewa duk abin da za a yi an tallafa mutanen Kano. Na tabbatar kuma mutanen Kano za su samu fahimta wannan, su ba gwamnati goyon baya. I will conclude my remarks by the fact that we must appreciate the difficulty of arriving at the present decision. I've gone into elaborate explanation of how we arrived at the decision of extending the ease of the lockdown. It's not the lockdown. We have not imposed any new protocols. We are just extending the phase 1. Why? Because in spite of the modest success of the phase 1, we think we cannot release other components to come into phase 2, because we need to deal with certain fundamentals, knowing now that the seeding of the infection has gone beyond what you think in terms of areas. It has gone to the community level. We need to ensure that we have in place in the communities certain infrastructure that will begin to deal with these infections as they have now gone into the community level. So there are so many things that we need to put in place. The second segment, which is the phase 2, even the industries, the kind of enterprises, the kind of businesses that will be opened up. In the coming days, guidelines will be issued as to what they need to put in place before we get to opening the phase 2. So there are so many processes that we have to put in place. And I always am conscious of the fact that we must acknowledge where we are in terms of our medical infrastructure, that we do not allow ourselves to be overwhelmed. So we must take every step in a deliberate and calculated manner to ensure that whatever we do, we can have some openings to either accommodate, be able to take on what might befall us. Coronavirus is unpredictable, it has its nature, it's disruptive, and it has come to ravage our health and our wealth. And we need to do everything collectively as a nation to ensure that we accommodate the national response in such a manner that we will be able to give our people succor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of today's national briefing. There was a question on education, that's the NECO exam. The information from the Minister of State is that parents should please await government announcement. There is no approval yet for the NECO exams to hold. When that approval comes, it will be made public. We must once again thank all our partners, the media especially, for taking this right to the homes and offices of Nigerians, and for all those that have stood by us all through. We say a very big thank you, especially also the health workers, the armed forces, the security agents, and what have you. We say thank you to everybody. But there are messages coming out of this briefing. The first is that the 2 weeks extension of phase 1 of the East restriction is also to enable all the segments of the economy prepare adequately for compliance with the guidelines preparatory to opening in the coming weeks. For the PTF, we share your pains, but our future is in the hands of every Nigerian, and future decisions will depend greatly on our compliance. The second message is an appeal. We wish to appeal to all Nigerians to show understanding, demonstrate patriotism, and take responsibility. Humanity is in great peril, and we are all in danger. Most importantly, we repeat our call on Nigerians to please stay home if you have to, and stay safe. God bless Nigeria. We hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.